So we can produce very well educated teens about mental health, but until we're healthy, it is impossible for them to be healthy because they won't see it modeled. They won't practice it. They'll be able to give you and regurgitate all of the intellectual musings of what mental health looks like, but we have to really live this thing out authentically close to them. So they have to see us process, forgive, extend grace, check in, and not be impatient when it comes to that check-in period. Perhaps I may need a few moments to even figure out how I'm doing to share that out with you. And so being graceful, hey, I'd love to talk about that as soon as you're ready.
Well, so we're here to have some critical conversations that pertain to the church, especially focusing on the next generation or younger people. My name is Ray Chang, and I serve as the Executive Director of the 10 by 10 Collaboration, which is a youth discipleship initiative seeking to make faith matter more for 10 million young people over the course of the next 10 years. I also have the privilege of serving as the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, which is an organization that seeks to unlock and unleash the gifts of the Asian American church to the broader world. I'm so thrilled to be with my esteemed colleagues and friends to have a very important conversation today. Before we begin, could you each take a moment to introduce yourselves? Maybe we'll start with you.
Oh, well, hi everyone. My name is Dr. Sarita Lyons, and I'm from Philadelphia. I'm on staff at Epiphany Fellowship Church as the Director of Discipleship and Women's Ministries, and I do Christian education as well. I'm trained, I have a doctorate degree in clinical and forensic psychology and a law degree. So I've been in private practice for many years prior to going on staff full-time and going into full-time ministry.
Okay, so don't say anything that'll
She
get you
should have
sued.
gone last, because she wins when it comes to the
She'll sue us and then she'll therapize us.
I'm John Onwuchekwa. I pastored for 16 years in Atlanta, and most recently, I'm the Director of Resources for Christianity Today. So I do that, and I guess my presence here in this conversation was 6 weeks before we planted our last church 8 years ago. My brother died, and I did not take care of myself and went right into a church plant. And so I have been acquainted with grief very deeply, and I know a whole lot about what not to do. So maybe my contribution is going to be what not to do, and you can clean it up for us.
Blessings all. I'm Jonathan Banks. I serve with Urban Outreach Foundation. We do coaching courses and curriculum for pastors, leaders, and churches, primarily in the urban African American space.
My name is Kevin Yee. I was a youth pastor for the last 18 years at Church Every Day. It's a Korean American immigrant church in Los Angeles. And I'm also with the Asian American Christian Collaborative, and currently I work with college and young adults.
So we're having a pretty significant conversation, one that I'm not sure if all of us have grown up with, but we're talking about mental health in the church. I know for myself, mental health wasn't a thing that was talked about growing up. It was certainly not talked about in my immigrant home as well as in my immigrant church context. And more often than not, to address issues of mental health was very much seen as taboo. And so it was seen as a deficiency or a form of weakness in which we would not be willing to admit to others. But curious, what's your experience been, and do you feel like mental health is a difficult issue to address? And if so, why is it so taboo to talk about mental health and therapy?
We're looking at you, Dr. Sarita.
Well, for many of the reasons you just named in terms of the stigmatization around it being a weakness or an inherent deficiency of the person. So instead of us thinking about mental health issues the way we would a cold or diabetes or cancer or anything like that, we often attribute mental health issues to a defect of character. So it's an attack on a person versus something someone is struggling with. I also think one of the reasons why there's been a lot of taboo-ness around mental illness is because of how it's also portrayed in the media, right? So the media has been a very powerful influence on how we think of mental illness. So if you see movies where the crazy person is in the subway and they look homeless or their life is unraveling, you don't often, especially in the past, you see a little bit more authenticity around mental illness portrayals now. But in the past, like, life didn't go well for you if you had mental illness. You didn't have much of a future. You were broke. You were disheveled. You were alone. And so who wants to be associated with things like that? And so as we've grown, I believe there have been a lot of changes as we've talked more and more about it, as leaders have been more open and honest about their own struggles and their need for mental health and counseling and even medication. I think we've... She doesn't understand, we don't understand.
We don't understand.
I think it's become a little bit more normalized. We still have some ways to go, but we definitely aren't where we were.
I'm curious because I think that when it comes to our mental health, there's such a lack of personal, individual awareness of how we're doing. And so I can't share with you how I'm doing if I'm not in touch with my own emotions, well-being, and mental health. So we have such a deficit of awareness and tools to check in individually, personally with myself, and then certainly our culture doesn't lend itself to us checking in mentally and emotionally with each other. I think we're just not trained and not equipped to do that.
To your point about the culture, like, we're almost trained from a very, very early age to not really process that deeply about ourselves. Because, like, when you ask somebody, how are you doing? What's the expectation? What do you expect it to hear? You're supposed to hear, I'm good, or I'm fine, or right? Like, we're just almost expected to do that. And so it's almost like American culture celebrates the happy. And so I think, especially coming from an Asian immigrant background, there's the performance aspect of our culture coupled with this idea that America is the happiest country in the world makes it so that we have to be so vulnerable to get to a place where we can start to admit that there might be something wrong. But on top of that, we have to eliminate the fear of then admitting to ourselves that maybe something is wrong and that I need help. And that's not something that's easy to admit. It's very, very difficult to get to that place.
Yeah, I think by and large, most people would say patience is a virtue, and I think it's easy to get agreement and alignment in terms of where we are today to talk about the virtue of patience as it relates to productivity in our world that consistently wants to push us to get things done. But I found that across the board, there are very few people that commend the virtue of patience when it comes to dealing with grief or mental health. I think we as people are just very impatient when it comes to that because it's such an inconvenience that we want to do whatever we can to move us through and along, and it's just slow work. And so to settle into things like that as solutions resigns us to saying, all right, well, we're going to be here for a long time. And nobody wants to be in an uncomfortable place for a long time.
So interesting. I would also just add to that, you mentioned about some Asian American homes and a lot of African American, Black and brown homes. There were so many deficits. It was almost as though mental health was a luxury that we could not afford because of the urgency of provision, safety, and other demands that checking in with someone mentally was the last thing on your mind. You know, is everyone breathing? Is everyone good? You know, did we feed everybody? Did you make it to school on time? And so there are so many other urgent, presumably urgent, mental health is an urgent need, but it was just lower on our scale of priorities.
And not to stay on this one, but it is that I think we do have a nasty habit of justifying something's value by comparing it to something else. So when you do talk about just the like swath or the spectrum of trauma, right, that comes from tangible losses. I've lost a loved one funeral after funeral after funeral, and you talk about ambiguous losses. I may not have lost a loved one, but it seems like dream after dream, friendship after friendship is dying. When you find yourself in a context where people are constantly dealing with an unfair and inordinate amount of tangible losses, you can almost feel guilty, or like those lesser losses aren't real because they're not as big as these ones. And so there is no space for people to really process.
Yeah, and I just want to say, obviously, one of the things I think is great, we're having this conversation, and I'm talking to four men, talking with four men, and I'm the only woman, because when it comes to mental health, we're socialized a lot around gender issues. And so oftentimes women are asked, how do you feel? And men are asked, what do you think? And so if men are mostly asked what they think and not how they feel, it's not even normal for men to be in touch. And then when women are constantly asked how they feel and not how they think, then we think that women are good mentally just because we're asking them to be in touch with their feelings in a way we don't think about men. I would also just add, as a foundational issue around taboo-ness and all that, we have to think about historically how racism has also impacted how people connect with and view mental health, and even how we think about our own wellness and state of being. Because even in slavery and post-slavery, mental health was pathologized, right? And so even things were made up. I mean, if you do some of the research, there were doctors who literally made up diagnoses for slaves who had the audacity to run away, who had the audacity to have freedom, want freedom. So you create mental illness called like drapetomania, which is this idea that a slave would be somehow have a mental defect because they are resistant to oppression. And that the solutions for the mental defect were to be whipped more, right? Or that they were called lazy, even though what they might have is infection in the body, right? From being whipped and sores and bacteria. So they literally had an infection which didn't allow them to push through and work, but that was pathologized as a mental illness. So we have a long history of how mental illness was used against certain people groups, so that now to think, oh, be okay with having something wrong mentally. I mean, even if you don't know those stories, kind of encoded into our DNA and psyche and culture is this idea that you are punishable, you are different, and you are defective, right? If you have some kind of mental illness that is legitimate.
The compounding nature of the pain and the trauma, the fact that we minimize our own pain and the wounds that we're carrying through comparing with our own experiences and with others, the histories that we don't know that impact us, that we know that impact us, and it's a lot. That seems like a lot of things to do when you hear a lot of people just say, just preach the gospel. Is there space for this within the church? Should we address this? If we do, or if we should, how do we do it?
Well, I think prior generations would, of course, quote the scripture that he will keep you in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on him. And that was enough for them. And of course, nowadays for teens and young adults, if the gospel isn't relevant in the softer parts of their life, the parts that deal with their core and who they identify as, then it's an irrelevant gospel. It's a gospel that doesn't see me, doesn't value me, and won't help me achieve what I believe is my God-given potential. So then it becomes an irrelevant gospel. And so no, yes, God will keep you in perfect peace, but there are benefits in being connected in real and tangible ways. There are health benefits, mental health benefits, physical health benefits, and we need to champion those and also normalize strengthening yourself mentally. So we like to force this dichotomy. You either have a mental health challenge or you're as strong as anyone else, where there's a spectrum. There are seasons that you'll go through, and we have to normalize from leadership to parenting that it's okay to check in. It's okay to let people know, hey, I could use some strength or support in this area. And that would just go such a long way in helping young people and teens see that they are okay, that it's not a defect, that we're humans created to experience various levels of strength and need mentally and spiritually, and that we should rely and coach each other.
I think, too, we have to know the Bible a little bit better, because I think that there's a lot of evidence that not only is God not anti-counseling, anti-therapy, he's actually the first therapist. So, even when God made man and woman, the first thing God starts doing is talking to them. He's literally counseling them. He's literally telling them about the way that they should live and what to do. He's instructing them. You look at the Psalms, and the Bible says that I will counsel you. God says, I will counsel you with my eye upon you, right? He even says, just taking it away from the vertical relationship between us and God, making it horizontal. He says, confess your faults one to another and not be gossiped about, but be healed. So that confession, unburdening the soul, right? Even journaling is a way, but talking is a way to ventilate the soul, is a pathway to healing. So many of us are not experiencing the healing we desperately desire, not because we haven't prayed hard enough, not because we don't have the faith, but we haven't done any confessing. We haven't talked to anyone. And so I think that really it's not about like God is okay with it, but God is the author of it. God called us into community. He called us to help one another. He says, cast your anxieties. He's like, the word is anxiety, care, roll them onto God. And I think when we think about rolling them onto God, it's also rolling them onto the prescriptions and ways that God has envisioned for you to be helped. Not that God wants to be the only one. We're supposed to be the hands and feet of Jesus. He says it's not good that we're alone. We're supposed to operate in community. We're supposed to practice the one another's. So whether it's professional or lay, we're supposed to be a healthy community, a safe community where people get some of their needs met, and some of them are mental health needs or their emotional needs. And just even as a clinician, I think one of the misnomers even about therapy, and maybe it's because of insurances, because you can't get treatment paid for unless there's a diagnosis. So if you're in private practice and you don't need to diagnose everyone so quickly, you're able to get to know a person and not label them. But I think there are so many people that should go to therapy and could benefit from therapy that don't actually meet DSM-5, Diagnostic Statistical Manual. That's our book that helps us diagnose disorders. People don't necessarily have to meet DSM-4 criteria for a mental health issue in order to benefit from counseling. And so I think we have to kind of reframe how we think about how to care for ourselves, not pathologize everything, and also understand that medicine, right, is a grace from God. That is a grace, right? Women say epidural, that's a grace. When you have a baby, that's a grace. Hallelujah, that's a grace from God. But so is Prozac. So is Haldol if you need it, you know what I mean? So is Abilify. So, not to do an ad for the pharmaceutical company, but I'm just saying whatever God has available, those things ought to be seen as grace options versus evidence of lack of faith or trust.
Dr. Lyons, I just want to add, I love what you have to say about how God invites Adam and Eve into processing and into counseling. But after they sin, I don't know if people know this, but God asks, the first three things that God says is questions. He knows the answer. He knows where they are in the Garden of Eden. He knows what they've been up to. He knows what happened. But why does he ask them questions? It's because he's inviting them into relationship. And then you go to the New Testament, and Jesus is asking over 300 questions. All the time, they're drawing out answers. And isn't that what a good counselor does? Right? And good counseling actually teaches us as lay leaders, as pastors, as shepherds in churches, like how to do that. So even if you don't have a mental health issue, honestly, just with regards to how to do ministry better, if you yourself are able to get counseling, you learn how to better ask questions and how to become a better active listener, which is all a part of discipleship and ministry. Yeah.
So then what happens if mental health issues go unaddressed? What happens when grief goes unaddressed, or depression or anxiety? What do you see if that's left ignored within the church?
So, I mean, I'll speak specifically to grief because it was, we saw this, we started our church 8.5 years ago, and it was a bunch of 30-somethings. So we weren't acquainted with grief like that. And, March of that year, somebody's mom dies. April that year, my brother dies. May that year, somebody's sister dies. June that year, the day we start the church, things are good. We come back home, my wife's grandmother dies. And in this young church of not a lot of people, it was every few weeks for 8 months until we buried our first church member, January. And we just saw, right, grief not like sit, right? Grief sat, or grief like signed a long-term lease and refused to be evicted. And what you find is that grief, it just like hardens and it settles, and it has this ability to just remove hope from a community. And I think what we learned is that when those things go unaddressed, that you start to find out tragedy is not the real problem. Tragedy doesn't ruin anybody or any community. Hopelessness does. Yes, and where there's hopelessness, then what you find is that we bounce all of the checks that we write as a church about what the gospel's meant to do in this world, right? We have a religion that's fundamentally rooted not just in rules, but in an event that Jesus got up from the most hopeless place. So our message should be, no. All of us can feel hopeless. We feel it, but the reality of the resurrection reminds us that we never actually are hopeless. That's the core of what we say. And so if this stuff goes unaddressed, then what we'll find is that we'll create and reproduce communities that talk a whole lot about the gospel, but are deficient of the power that has, or of the power that's meant to change and transform. So we put out a product in the world that ends up undermining the very power of the gospel that we talk through. So learning to address this is some of our most fundamental work because it's inescapable.
Yeah, and I want to actually, because I did frame like grief under the mental health. Is grief connected to mental health? Is anxiety? I mean, sometimes you don't feel it in your head, you feel it in your stomach, you feel it in your chest. What's the connection between your emotional life, your mental life, when it comes to mental health?
Yeah, I think in the world of psychology or counseling, we would call that psychosomatic. So when you are having mental health symptoms, emotional, psychological symptoms or distress that show up in your body, whether your skin breaks out, whether you're having digestive issues, whether you're having sleep disturbances, like eating too much, eating too little. So heart palpitations, if you think about the fight, flight, anxiety shows up in the body, literally. Your heart races, your palms sweat, your brain is sending signals for you to either fight or flee, or we've also learned another reaction can be freeze. So our body, we are people. We are both mind, we are body, and we are spirit. And one of the things that we often do in the Western world is we compartmentalize those so much, but really we don't think about them having an influence on one another. So what's going on in my mind affects how I'm feeling. What I'm feeling often affects my body and all in between. And so we really want comprehensive health. We want something like holistic health. We don't want to just go to the gym and then not deal with our emotions, right? We don't want to be on a vegan diet, right? You know what I mean? But then we never actually walk anywhere or go out to exercise. So we need to be taking care of all of ourselves and our spiritual health. And I think oftentimes what the church has done is taught a gospel or sold a Christianity that said if you're only addressing your spiritual side, your church activity, your spiritual disciplines, your serving, then somehow that supersedes the other areas of your life. But I really think the Bible paints a picture of everything being spiritual. So what I do physically in my body is also spiritual. How I feel, my emotion, that's also a part of my spiritual life. And you know, in the scriptures where it says that God wants you to prosper as your whole soul, your total person prospers. He's talking about the totality of who you are. And so I think one of the things the church can benefit from is even just teaching about psychosomatic disorders, or just how your emotional life will show up. For me personally, I don't struggle with what you consider typical anxiety symptoms or stress, like mental stress, in that way that really depletes me. But what will happen is I've had shingles twice. So before I was 40 years old, I was the youngest person my doctor said she ever saw with shingles. And then I was also diagnosed with shingles again in my mid-40s. When I'm stressed, I know, I'm like, oh Lord, I need to get myself together. I need help. My eye will begin to twitch. So sometimes what I feel might not, but we need to start paying attention. How does our unique body and physicality begin to send us signals that we're off pace, that we're in distress? And I think that's a grace. And many times when we are not doing well, we feel condemned. We feel condemnation. I'm not spiritual enough. I must not trust God enough. I haven't been reading my word enough. When life is just lifing sometimes. And God is just calling us to reorient ourselves. Maybe Christ is a little off center in our lives. Maybe we haven't been talking about some of the things we really need to talk about. We haven't unburdened our soul. Maybe we're suppressing or repressing painful emotions like grief. You know, instead of letting grief be a teacher, it becomes an enemy. So just all those things. I think that we have to normalize living in a broken and fallen world. So that means everything is jacked up. But the hope of the gospel is that we have not only an eschatological promise, an eternal promise to come where we have new bodies and we're no longer struggling, but we have power to live well right now. We have something useful that the gospel does for us in this present, this not what it was, but not what it will be state, that will help us live in a way that doesn't compromise our witness, right? Because we're a vessel, we're a temple, and the enemy wants nothing more than our mind and our body and our spirit to break down.
Clinical term?
That's what came to my mind. Jacked up came to my mind. But Ray, you asked, what is broken, or what are the effects of neglecting mental health? And I really see relationships, interpersonal relationships, being the first tragedy. Because if I sense that something is off with you, you know, what we would say off, I may take it personally, and I'm offended because you have withdrawn, or you are short, you lack patience, perhaps you're not as engaged as you used to be in our relationship or our friendship. And so I take it personally. And so interpersonal relationships break down, and therefore we also end up in a worse state of mental health, because then our support group is broken and we don't connect with each other on deeper levels. And the last thing that I'll add to that is that a number of schools have begun to invest in social and emotional learning. And of course, we know that some of the most successful business people have strength in social and emotional areas. And so we need to champion and share that these are areas that we want to grow stronger in. And even if we can't get past some of our cultural demonization of weakness, at least let people know that, hey, when you're strong in this area, you bring your best self to our relationship, to the job, to the ministry. And that's what we want. We want you at your best so that we can best support you and that you make the collective better.
Wow. I also think if we don't talk about this in this current generation, then we're just passing down generational trauma to the next, right? And I think the last couple of years have raised that issue to the forefront. I think especially in the Asian American community, more and more people are talking about this issue of like, oh wait, the things that I went through in my home growing up were part of generational trauma. So now you have this movement of people wanting to know their histories, to get a better sense, because our parents won't share those stories with us. But as we're getting a general sense of the history and general sense of what's going on, we're learning from that. And when we're called to be the generation that says, okay, this is going to stop with us, then we don't pass those things down to our kids, and we're able to have healthier conversations. And so, to your point about like being present, being fully present as a parent, I realized my parents weren't able to do that because they're carrying all these things, and they're carrying all these things that they can't identify as mental health, but I can see that, and I can make sure that I'm not passing those things down to my kids. And so that's how we set people free from these things, in recognizing these things and just having a lot more grace towards generations above us, and especially for the sake of the generations to come. Yeah.
One thing I'll just say really quickly, one of the things that the outcome or a consequence of not addressing it is that we just live a lie. When I was in private practice, one of the things I would often say to my clients day one of therapy is just, let's make a pact. No matter what, you will refuse to pretend. You will just refuse to pretend. And I think that is characterizes so much of what we see in the church. And that's really where we get the word hypocrisy, right? The Greek word really is translated actor. And so hypocrisy is to become an actor. We just constantly pretend. And if you think about the consequence that then has on who we are supposed to be representing, right? A God who came in grace and truth. We're supposed to be truth tellers, but we live lies. And so I think that, man, if the church would feel safe enough to just not pretend about anything, no matter how hard it was, how jacked up it is, not worrying about what people think, but really, really just refuse to pretend. I think that actually revolutionizes relationships. I mean, what if all marriages just decided we're not going to pretend? That doesn't mean we're not going to not have grace, and we're not going to be loving and patient and long-suffering, but I won't pretend. What if pastors stopped pretending? What if parishioners, what if men, what if women, what if children were given permission to not pretend? What if boys were told, if you're hurt, you don't have to pretend that you're not hurt. And if you're a woman, a girl, and you're angry, you don't have to pretend that you're not, right? So just the conditioning of being a liar, when lying is one of the things that God said he hates. And so lying with your life, lying about your health is also very, very devastating to the church.
And I think, to add to that, is sometimes we don't know that we're living in the lie because of what we've been conditioned into. So I didn't have language for sadness or hurt. I didn't know how to say that I'm even angry at times. To say I'm scared, it probably took me into my late 30s before I was first able to say, I'm feeling scared. Like, wow. And then as soon as I say it, there's like wow, I'm feeling scared.
Yes.
That's so wonderful.
Anybody else scared? They're all scared.
Everyone.
Go scared people.
But I couldn't identify it because I didn't have the language. Even though I knew that the word existed, I couldn't tie that word to my internal experience. And so even in my own journey, the thing that I've tried to do in my kind of counseling relationships is to approach it by saying, like, what is the most honest thing I can say about what is going on within me at this moment? And I'm still working on it. It's still super hard, but I do find that it's extremely helpful. Now, we're rounding out, and one of the things that we're concerned about is reaching the next generation. It's marked by terms like depression and anxiety. There's high levels of anxiety within Generation Z, high levels of depression. What do you think contributes to that? And then whether you're a part of Gen Z or not, how do we become healthy emotionally, mentally? What are we seeking to do? What are some practical things people can do moving forward? What did you do?
So for me, it was just these small commitments that I made in my life. So I'll never forget, in that first year, got into an argument with my wife that was so big over something so small. It ended with, right, it was me being on the wrong side of every door, right? She would ask me how I was. I would say, stop trying to fix me. She wouldn't ask me. I would be like, you don't care. And so we got into this fight, and she was getting ready to leave the house one day. She's like, I'm gone. And for me, it was like, well, let me help you pack a bag. As soon as she left, I knew I made the worst mistake in my life, and I have not felt that low in my entire life. I was at the lowest point that I was in my life, and the only thing I could think to do was to text some of my friends and the guys that I was getting ready to start the church with. In 4 minutes, they were at my front doorstep, because we all made the commitment, not just to plant a church there, but to buy homes in the same neighborhood. And it was at that point that I realized, when you're that low, and anybody that's been that low knows it, but when you're that low, the difference between somebody showing up at your house in 4 minutes and 34 minutes is the difference between suicidal thoughts and an attempt. And after that point, just one thing that I said for me was, I am never going to live more than 4 minutes away from my closest friends in the world. So literally, if they all get up and moved, and it's like, sweetheart, we're putting our crib on the market. And it's just, I have just learned that it is, people say man was not meant to be alone. No, but I've learned, for me, it's a matter of life or death, because I know that nothing in life is going to be everything that you thought it would be. I know I've pastored for long enough and had enough loss in my life to know nothing in life is as sure or as stable as you think it is. Everybody's life can change that quickly. And I just want to be sure that the people in my life form a safety net of sorts, so that whenever I fall off of whatever tightrope that I'm on, because we're all walking on a tightrope, I just want to be sure that there's a net that can catch me.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That's deep and very vulnerable, and kind of reaching out for help, making sure that you have a tight-knit community that you can be vulnerable with. And I think most people don't realize how much they need community until they actually need it.
I heard a John Maxwell quote that said, we teach what we know, but we reproduce who we are. So we can produce very well educated teens about mental health, but until we're healthy, it is impossible for them to be healthy, because they won't see it modeled. They won't practice it. They'll be able to give you and regurgitate all of the intellectual musings of what mental health looks like, but we have to really live this thing out authentically close to them. So they have to see us process, forgive, extend grace, check in, and not be impatient when it comes to that check-in period. Perhaps I may need a few moments to even figure out how I'm doing to share that out with you. And so being graceful, hey, I'd love to talk about that as soon as you're ready. And so there's no rush. Just let me know how you're doing. And we haven't found those safe sharing practices that help our young people see it in us, and to a point of health where they then desire it and are willing to work towards it. Mental health has never happened by accident that I've seen. It's always with intentionality and diligence. And you only apply those two things when you believe that it's worth it.
That's good. I mean, I think some practical things, one, especially when you think about youth workers or even educating parents, about how mental health often shows up very differently in children versus adults. So, when you think of depression, most adults think of like sadness, mopiness, I can't get out of bed, I can't sleep or eat, or those sorts of things. But with children, depression often shows up as anger. And so many children are often labeled as oppositionally defiant or have an oppositionally defiant disorder, when really these are really depressed kids who are acting out, but it's based on undiagnosed depression. And so just even knowing that helps you as a youth worker understand kids a little bit better, ask different questions. I also think we are raising children to come into a grind culture where your value is attached to your productivity and busyness is esteemed, and not rest, not stillness, not breathing, intentional breathing, right? Quietness. So I think even doing practices with young people, what if before Bible study or when people met with their youth or people just said, everybody just sit quietly. Like learning to just be still and be quiet and take breaths, and practicing forms of mindfulness, being in touch with how they feel, doing things like body scans. Because we're so busy, we don't even know what our body is feeling because we are over talking our body by busyness. So I think there's some just small practical tools that you can do to even normalize rest, to normalize quietness, to normalize stillness, helping young people journal, right? Because not everyone is a verbal processor. Some people have to write to process. Some people, you know what I mean? So just thinking about just like we're different learners, we're different processors, right? Some people learn as they talk. So verbal people, yes, you think, oh, they'll do great in, talk therapy. But a lot of times people just need to write some stuff. Allowing young people to use the arts and creativity, whether it's dancing or spoken word or rap or whatever, to even just get in touch with their emotions. So I think those are the kind of things we can do to build healthier young people. And as been previously said, I think parents, adults have to lead by example and do their own work. And many times we are dumping on young people out of the frustration of our own disorders, our own lack of health. And young people who have less power, less voice, less agency often, are just kind of the pin cushions, and they become the garbage cans of us vomiting up our emotional issues. And so I do think we have to think about how do we take care of the church, take care of parents, take care of adults, take care of youth leaders so that we can better instruct and care for younger people.
A friend of mine actually, she's a counselor, and she came to speak at one of our young adult retreats, and she did that right before she spoke. She just asked everyone, hey, take a really deep breath, and just from top to bottom, just spend a few moments just thinking about how well you're doing. Just pay attention to your body right now. And it was so powerful. It was so transformative. And it's something that we've tried to incorporate in various places, just to remind ourselves that, like, pay attention to where your body is right now, even as you're about to enter into small groups or Bible study or something like that. And just what it does is it kind of connects your whole self to what you're about to hear from God's word. And that's pretty powerful. The other thing that I would just want to share is, like, as somebody who really, again, just hasn't worked through a lot of the mental health issues that I had when I was a child, I have a deep fear that the more I talk about mental health, the more young people will think, oh, well, I don't need Jesus then. Right, that's what I'm coming to the table with sometimes when it comes to this issue, and so I'm afraid that, like, wait, but you guys have to understand, like Jesus first, and then all of this. But I'm coming to realize now that actually, again, it's the dichotomizing of those things, and it's not understanding that actually, Jesus walks alongside all of those things, and I shouldn't be afraid to tell people that you should go see therapy, as if I say that, then they'll leave the church because they're going to find their answers. Because the truth is, therapy is not all the answers either, right? So we know that deeply. So it's like I don't want my confidence in the gospel to be shaken by something that feels so frightening. And so I just want to, just encourage, like, leaders and pastors to understand that, like, we don't have to be afraid of this.
I think a great example in the scriptures that points out what you're talking about is when Jesus is with Mary and Martha. And Jesus notices Mary's anger because she's like, Martha's anger about Mary not helping clean up or whatever was going on. And he says, Martha, Martha, you are worried about many things. So he attaches her behavior to an internal experience that she was unaware of. He says, you are worried about many things, but Mary has chosen the greater portion. So he's basically combining, you're so worried, you should actually be doing what Mary is doing, which is being with me. Yeah. But so it doesn't mean you have to dichotomize, but Jesus lovingly doesn't say, how dare you talk to your sister that way? But he's like, you're worried. you're stressed, you're anxious, you're whatever it is, sometimes being able to say, yes, you do come to Jesus, right, with that, versus demonize what the person is experiencing.
I think too of like the whole book of Proverbs, right? So if you think Israel was probably the latest in the game to get into the wisdom literature book. So you can go and see, no, there's a swath of sections that literally were written as Egyptian wisdom centuries ago. But the difference was they're like, but the key to all of this is the fear of the Lord. Without that key, this is just wisdom. But once you insert that key, now you really have the power to know when to be kind and just to let things roll off your back, and when to be truthful and to speak truth. And you're not going to rely on your instincts to where you just respond based on your current disposition. So it's not that this truth somehow invalidates Christianity, but it's, no. This truth, absence of the key that unlocks it, or this truth really shows the need of, there needs to be something else to activate it. And so in that way, I do think that, us as leaders not shying away from it, but starting to talk about it and embrace it is one of the greatest invitations to this next generation of folks who have already seen the insufficiency of just preach the gospel and don't talk about this at all. Now they're just trying to navigate their way through all of this.
Yeah, and I think our teaching, with particularly young people, our teaching and our discipleship has to become way more contextualized, because we're not just contending with like truth versus lie. We're talking about culture. And we're talking about what does it mean to address the cultural ills. And so if you're just preaching Bible stories, if you're just like hammering young people with scripture, but you're not contextualizing it based on their lived experience, we're missing them. So some of the research shows with regard to mental illness, depression, anxiety, and things like that, one study showed that increased screen time and sleep deprivation was one of the leading causes for increased depression among young people, right? Another study showed that adolescents who have, this generation, you're talking about the generation like teens from like late 2000s to like 2017, early 2000s to 2017, this generation has seen more violence on repeat through social media and television than any other generation. And you see a spike in depression around 2011 when smartphones came on the scene. So there is a correlation that we have to just know, so that when we're talking to young people who are tied to their phones all the time, there's a relationship between how you might be feeling and some of the ways in which you've just been conditioned to living. Also, another study showed that young people or people from that generation are more concerned about climate. Older generations are kind of like, baby, I'm leaving here and can't take none of this with, and they're actually thinking about the trees and the plants and in ways that older generations are not. So even to think that people are really scared and concerned about climate. And another study was pointing out the fact that that generation is also have a heightened sensitivity to mass shootings and school shootings or violence that's happening in public places. So when we gather young people and we're talking about mental illness or mental health and we're telling them to take some deep breaths, and then we just kind of go into, I don't mean to say random Bible study, but if we're not using Bible study to address what they're thinking about, what they're exposed to, how they're living, then I think we do them a disservice. We have to talk about the culture that they're in, the music that they're listening to, what they're exposed to on television, their relationship. They're having a relationship with a phone more than people. Most of young people's friends, it's how do you have 100,000 friends? How do you have 10,000 friends, but you don't actually talk to anyone? So those are some of the things I think the gospel wants to speak into as well. Wisdom wants to speak into as well.
That's good. Well, thanks for having this conversation with us. What a rich conversation. How would someone who doesn't know whether they should go to therapy or not, decide to go, and if they did want to go, where would they start?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question and should alert the church that we need to create resource lists. I think a lot of times we're trying to change wheels on a moving bus. And so every church, just to start with that part, should be thinking about who can we begin to build relationships with in our community who are people who do this work that we trust or we've gotten to know or maybe are believers, hopefully believers, that when we send someone to them, we have a little bit of knowledge about their expertise, their clinical ability, their heart for God, their heart for the people. So I think the churches need to create resource lists and we need to empower parents to have it. One of the things is I think they should just go. And what we don't often talk about in therapy is you can court a therapist. Like if you start with someone and you're not feeling them and it doesn't, I always tell people at least try to give it about 3 or 4 sessions because sometimes you don't like someone because they just telling you the truth or you don't really want to be there anyway. But if it's really not working for you, you absolutely can like end that relationship and try again. And so I think that it's okay to try different therapists out. And you don't sign your life away. You don't have to be in therapy forever. There's brief therapy, there's short-term therapy, there's crisis therapy, and then there's long-term therapy. So I think the best advice would be seek help from a parent or a church leader. Prayerfully, there's a resource list available. Ask people to make those initial appointments, and most therapists will give you a free consultation just to talk to you about what's going on, answer all your questions. And I think we need to talk to people about how to even interview therapists. What are some of the questions you ought to be asking them? How do you get to discern if they're even an expert in all the stuff they say they're an expert at on their website, and really get a sense of whether this person is someone you think will be a good fit for you.
That's good. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks so much for having this conversation. We look forward to having more.
Thank you.
Great.
That's great.